Well, good evening, everyone. Um, I'm amazed that there's so many of you here. I'm excited and a little nervous that there's so many of you here. If you're new to us, if a friend made you come and you had no choice, my name is Jeremy Troxler, and I serve as lead pastor here at Guilford College United Methodist Church. And I'm going to be sharing a presentation tonight about a recent journey that a group of us who are United Methodist ministers took to Northern Ireland that had the purpose of learning about the history of conflict there, but also studying what is involved in peacemaking in divided cultures and societies and even across lines of the church. And the idea was that we would go there and learn from that context, that place, and that experience, and be able to bring some of the lessons we learned back to our place and our time, which often today has its own challenges of division and difference, especially along political lines. So what I'm going to do is, for the first part of our presentation, I'm going to talk about Northern Ireland and just give you a little bit of the background and history of Northern Ireland, and especially the more recent history of conflict there between Roman Catholics and Protestants. And then in the middle portion, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey we took and some of the people that we met there and some of the stories and testimonies that they had to share. And then in the last little bit, I want to just share with you some lessons that I took back from that trip for me, for I hope us, and for all who long to see God's peace lived in the world. And so we'll kind of have three parts to this presentation tonight. My goal is not to bore you and not at any point to have this turn into like me just giving you a slideshow and then we went there and then we went there, all right? And I don't want it to be like a Rick Steves special or anything else either. We're really going to kind of dig into some history and some powerful stories. So to help us begin, I thought we would do this. I wonder if you would turn to 2 or 3 people around you, or if you're here with somebody, and share with them everything you know about Northern Ireland. This may not take long for many of us, all right? A few of you together, 2 or 3, everything you know about Northern Ireland, okay? How does this work, Josh? Oh. Got it. Thank you. All right, everybody. I'm really impressed that some of you are still talking. Like this is a knowledgeable group. I mean, well, for many of us, we may not know a lot about Northern Ireland. We may know a good bit about Ireland, and we may not have even realized, many of us, that there's a difference between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But they are actually 2 separate places, and if you're a map person like I am, there's some kind of maps on the screen where you can see where Ireland and Northern Ireland are in relation to the United Kingdom. And the fact that many of us didn't know there was a Northern Ireland is at the root of a lot of the conflict and the struggle that land has experienced. One of the speakers that spoke to us talked of working with refugee groups. Many refugees are resettling in Northern Ireland, and when they land there, they say, "Where exactly are we?" And what they say, "Are we in England or are we in Ireland?" And that is the root of the conflict. That is the question. Are those living there in England and Great Britain, or are they part of Ireland? So just a little bit of history, like the deep background. Many of you know that for a long time, Ireland, the entire kind of island, was ruled by Great Britain and its kings. It was essentially a kind of colony of England, part of the United Kingdom in that way. And the Irish people weren't always very happy about that. Many of them really struggled against British rule because they were a different ethnic people that had their own language, their own deep history as a people, and they often viewed the British as these outside colonizers that took over and ruled their land and plundered some of the wealth of its land and of its people. But what happened over time is more and more settlers from England and from Scotland began to settle in parts of Ireland among the native Irish people. And many of those settlers who came over, many of whom were Protestants, concentrated in that kind of northeast part of the country where Northern Ireland is. And so that part of the island began to have a much higher concentration of English people and Scottish people and also Protestant people than the rest of Ireland that was further from the UK and that would be more ethnically Irish in its character. So fast forwarding a lot, at the beginning of the 20th century, the independence movement in Ireland gained a lot of steam. It was fueled in part by a really important event that is referred to as the Easter Rising of 1916, where in the midst of the First World War, a group of Irish leaders in the city of Dublin essentially took over downtown Dublin and staged an uprising and invited the rest of the Irish people to join them in seeking independence from Great Britain. Now, that rising was put down, but it was put down in such a heavy-handed way that the sympathies of the people were raised towards that independence, and a movement began and expanded. So that after the First World War, the British government decided that it had no choice except to grant a kind of home rule to Ireland, to grant them greater freedom and independence, and to come to some kind of accommodation with each other. But there was a problem in that. You see that Northern Ireland corner up there, those people who were up in the corner, was an area often referred to as Ulster. And you remember that's where all of the British people and the Protestant people and the Scottish people had concentrated. And they were not at all interested in leaving the UK and joining with the rest of Ireland, which was ethnically and religiously different from they were. And so a kind of compromise was worked out where the rest of Ireland became the Irish Free State, but Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. Ulster stayed part of the kingdom. And there was almost no choice there because the people of Ulster got so upset when it began to be discussed that they might be joined with Ireland that they even raised a kind of militia that was going to fight against this and make sure that they weren't forced to become part of the rest of Ireland. So that is the root and the genesis of the conflict that we're going to be talking about tonight, where you have this history of these two parts of Ireland made up of very different groups of people. And they were different groups of people. You may not be able to quite read all this, but there were essentially, even within Northern Ireland, two traditions of folks. Right? So about 66% of the population of Northern Ireland in the early 20th century, 2/3 were of the Orange tradition, you might call it. They were Protestant, they were English or Scottish, they were loyal to the crown. They were mostly from like cities, or maybe not cities, but they had an industrial kind of background. And most of them were loyalists, is what they were called, because they were loyal to the king and the queen. Now, some of the big dates in their history, they would often look back to July the 12th in 1690 when King William of Orange conquered a lot of the Irish rebels in the Battle of the Boyne. And they looked to that as kind of the real day that their people were established. And in fact, they celebrate this to this day every year, this triumph that took place like 300 years ago. Northern Irish Protestants still celebrate this. And they also remember that time very proudly when they raised a militia and said, we're not going with the rest of Ireland. We're going to remain with the United Kingdom and be our own people. But at the same time in Northern Ireland, 2/3 of the people are from that kind of orange camp. There is a minority population, about 1/3 of the folks, who are ethnically Irish and who are predominantly Roman Catholic. And they are Republican, not in the way of U.S. political parties, but they feel a great pull towards the Republic of Ireland. That's where they feel their deepest allegiances lie. They tend to be more from rural areas. They're referred to as nationalists because they're nationalist Irish. And they look back to that Easter Rising in Dublin as like a key moment in history that they're really proud of, and the day that the Irish nation became independent. And so what you had in Northern Ireland, you would often find in some areas of the city people flying 2 different national flags. So in the Protestant areas of Belfast, which is the city that we visited, you would see a lot of the Union Jacks because that's Great Britain, right? That's the United Kingdom. That's where their loyalty is. But in the Roman Catholic parts of Belfast, you would see the Irish flag, the tricolor, because that's where they felt their allegiance was most deeply to. And so you have this society that is very divided even about who should be in charge and who is the legitimate ruling authority, right? And those kind of differences mapped onto cultural differences. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the show Dairy Girls, but it's a show that is based on this group of young women growing up in Derry in Northern Ireland during the Troubles that we're going to talk about. And in one of the episodes, they go to a kind of retreat together with a group of Protestant kids and Catholic kids, and they write on the board the differences between them. And so there are things that are both serious and then kind of funny. Like, you can't quite read it, but it says Catholics love JFK, or Protestants can't have fun on Sundays, So there are all these kind of differences that they have between them that separate them in some way. And eventually those differences that were never resolved kind of came to a head during a period of time that are often referred to euphemistically as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And what was in some ways the cause of the Troubles, you might say, is what I heard someone refer to as the double minority problem. Right? So the problem is that you have a minority group in Northern Ireland who are the Roman Catholics, who are ethnically Irish, and who feel like the majority is not respecting their rights, is not helping them in any way, that is seizing and holding on to all the power. And so they are a minority and are feeling the brunt of being a minority, and cannot get the predominantly Protestant and English government to listen to their concerns. Well, the Protestant government and the Protestant people, even though they're the majority in Northern Ireland, they're a minority on the island of Ireland. And they're a minority within Great Britain. And so they kind of feel like they have to hold on to power tightly. Because if they don't, they might lose power. They might be subsumed in the larger part of Ireland. Or it might even be that the Catholic population, because it's growing, is gradually going to have more and more votes and is going to take them over. And they're afraid of becoming minority in their own culture. And so behind this conflict is this fear of being in the minority and not having power and having the majority group use all the power in ways that don't respect the minority. Right? Now, some people, even before the Troubles, on the kind of Irish side of this debate, had engaged in some acts of violence, trying to get the people of Northern Ireland to raise up and leave the United Kingdom. They were referred to as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Many of you, if you haven't heard anything else about Northern Ireland, you've heard a little bit about the IRA. That is some of the backstory. And what happened is you have this group where you have the Protestants and Catholics, and they're kind of intermixed and intermingled in different ways. And in the 1960s, there began to be a movement among the Roman Catholic minority demanding greater civil rights. And this movement was largely inspired by the civil rights movement then taking place in the United States and led by African Americans in the black church. And specifically, the grievances that the Roman Catholic minority had was that they had a lack of representation in the voting, much like was taking place here in the segregated South. The rules regarding voting basically said only the homeowner or property owner could vote. And so if you had a large family with a mom and a dad, but they're like 4 kids over the age of 18 living together, as was always often the case, that's only 2 votes rather than 6. And so people began to say that's not fair. And it was also the case that because of gerrymandering and the way the districts were done, the Roman Catholic minority was underrepresented in the overall government. They were also not represented in the police force and the military. They essentially weren't allowed to serve in those ways. And so what happened was they started to engage in peaceful protest, and it was peaceful, some of these protests at first, seeking these rights. But many of those protests were put down fairly harshly. There was one in particular where, I'll come back to that, a group of these nationalists wanted to imitate the Selma March in the United States, where Martin Luther King or others marched from Selma to the state capitol seeking voting rights. And so they were going to march from Belfast to Londonderry. But as they got close to Londonderry, they were attacked by Protestant loyalists and were basically beaten and were forced to flee. Now, some of those folks had been stirred up by a Protestant leader. His name was Reverend Ian Paisley. And Ian Paisley was both a minister and a fervent loyalist, loyal to the king. And he would basically preach sermons warning his congregations about how this growing Roman Catholic minority is going to take over and ruin their nation. And that they have to fight back and they have to assert their identity as people of Ulster and of Northern Ireland, that they could not give an inch to these people who are seeking, these minorities who are seeking greater civil rights. And one of the things that he would often say is that those protesters weren't actually peaceful, but they were actually just instruments of the IRA. The violent IRA was just using them, and not be fooled by what they're asking for. And so when those things began to happen, it started and deepened a conflict. The IRA, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, started to gain some more people who joined them seeking to fight against British rule and seeking not just civil rights, but independence from England and rejoining with Ireland. Now, in doing that, they started to engage in terrorist acts, bombings, assassinations, that in the beginning were targeted towards representatives of the government. Now, in their mind, they were not terrorists. They would tell everyone that they were freedom fighters, fighting to free their land from colonial oppression. And what happened as the IRA became more active, there were people on the Protestant side who said, we have to protect ourselves from these terrorists. And the government and police aren't able to do it on their own. So we need to form our own group. And so they started to form paramilitary groups like the Ulster Defense Association, that basically they would take matters into their own hands and they would defend their neighborhoods by looking out for the IRA and those committing violence. To give you an idea, this is the kind of mural that still you sometimes see in Belfast today. This is from the Ulster Volunteer Force. We seek nothing but the elementary right implanted in every man, the right, if you are attacked, to defend yourself. And you can't quite read it, but up at the top of that mural, it says, for God and Ulster. Right? So that was the kind of stance they took. Well, after some of those civil rights protests were put down, what happened is that fighting began between loyalists, members of the UVF that I just showed you, and members of the IRA. And there wasn't just fighting between them, but rioting started to break out in some of the cities, in certain areas, that might be directed against the government or against the police. And this began to happen in cities like Derry and Belfast. where there was great destruction and there began to be loss of life, these riots that were happening between Protestants and Catholics and others. And so what happened was the British military was called in to restore order and to keep the peace in some way. And at first, both sides, the neighborhoods, greeted these British soldiers as a relief. It was like, okay, they're going to come in and thank goodness things are going to settle down and maybe we can get back to not fighting and being in peace. There's some amazing footage of when the soldiers first came in, there were ladies from both the Catholic side and the Protestant side who would come out and who would serve them tea in the afternoon. And they would kind of compete with each other about who had the best tea and the best sandwiches, serving the soldiers and kind of welcoming them to their city. But what happened is that now that the soldiers were part of the city, the paramilitary groups now had a target that represented who they thought of as the enemy. And so the IRA in particular engaged in the murder of several soldiers who were occupying some of these cities. And the British military, again, maybe somewhat understandably, decided that it needed to crack down and root out these IRA terrorists and paramilitaries who were causing violence. But the way they did it was heavy-handed and involved a lot of searches and seizures and visits into homes in the middle of the night in Catholic neighborhoods. And it began to create a lot of animosity among that minority community. Because very often, and this is kind of documented, they wound up getting all the wrong people. They didn't wind up kind of getting the people who were the perpetrators of violence, but just other people that didn't have nothing much to do with it. And that just made things worse in terms of the animosity. Well, in 1972, in the city of Derry or Londonderry, a group of predominantly Roman Catholics held a kind of civil rights protest, protesting the various searches and seizures and other things that were happening. And some of you know, if you've heard something about Northern Ireland, what happened that day was called Bloody Sunday. If you haven't heard of it, U2 sings a song about it. So maybe you've heard about Bloody Sunday that way. But what happened is this protest had been declared illegal. When the protesters kind of entered into the city of the town, British soldiers tried to stop them. There was some throwing of rocks and some confrontation. And then a group of British soldiers began to fire into the crowd. And 13, and it has been proved unarmed protesters were shot dead by the British paratroopers that day. Well, maybe you can imagine what kind of happened after this happened. It only intensified the violence. Many people who would not have dreamed of associating with the IRA or joining the IRA after Bloody Sunday, someone said it was their biggest recruiting tool in history. And so people began to kind of join that part of things. The IRA retaliated with a series of bombs in Belfast on a day that people in Belfast referred to as Bloody Friday. And that instituted this series of reciprocal attacks, assassinations, bombings, acts of violence that we're not going into, but which continued over the course of many years as people on both sides of this, particularly extreme paramilitary groups, engaged in violence, and everybody else was kind of caught in the middle or forced to generally choose a side. This was the time of the gunman in Northern Ireland, and massed people and horrible violence and terrible killings. By the 1980s, there was another development in this story. A group of prisoners who were IRA prisoners who had been placed in jail decided to stage a hunger strike over the conditions of their captivity and also seeking the British government acknowledging the concerns of the Roman Catholic people of Northern Ireland. In the end, there were 10 hunger strikers who starved themselves to death in prison. And this may seem strange to us, but the news covered this development as each of these hunger strikers died. And it again brought the conflict kind of to the fore. And for some people, it brought more people to the nationalist side because this wasn't a violent act, but it was a more peaceful form of protest. This is a mural that is still on the streets of Belfast to Bobby Sands, who was the first hunger striker who died in prison on that side of things. So the end result was all this was Belfast, the city that we visited, and especially Derry, also in Northern Ireland, became very divided cities where basically there was a Roman Catholic area and there was a Protestant area. There'd be a few mixed areas, but for the most part, they were separated by barricades and walls and other things, and you did not travel in the other section. And where members of each group might even set up checkpoints and barricades to check anyone coming into their section to make sure that they weren't a terrorist or that they weren't out to get someone. I understand you could not park a car in downtown Belfast at all because of the fear of car bombings. You would have to park your car on the outside of the city and walk through gates in order to enter the city center. And I saw this mural, and I thought it was just kind of a representation of the state of things. That's a dove that has been shot through by two arrows. The dove being an image of peace. And for a long time, that is the state in which Northern Ireland, in which it lived as it struggled with this history. One of the lowest moments came in the 1993. And we heard about this very personally from someone I'm going to speak with you about later. There was a bombing in the Protestant area called the Shank Hill Road at a fish shop. The bombing was conducted by the IRA because above the fish shop was the headquarters of the UDA, which was the Protestant side. And this bombing, it was supposed to be a bomb that was set and would go off at night after everyone was gone, but the bomber accidentally blew himself up in setting the bomb, and so it went off at midday, and it killed very many people. And after what had been a relative period of peace, Northern Ireland again descended into a series of killings and conflict and bombings and other things. And it seemed, in my understanding, that was a moment when everyone looked into the abyss and just decided, we cannot live this way. We cannot live this way. And so there were these movements, these mass demonstrations of people who came out simply to say, it is time for peace. Protestants and Catholics together saying something has to change. And we'll go into this a little bit more later, but there had been dialogue for some time between the different parties about what a more lasting peace might look like. And finally, in 1998, all of the folks were able to get around a table. And there was this is a picture I took while walking along the coast there of the sun breaking through the clouds. That's what this was. It was the sun breaking through the clouds, and it was a time of hope. And these groups of people got together with the help of an American negotiator, George Mitchell, former U.S. Senator. And on Good Friday, 1998, they reached a kind of political peace accord among all of the different groups that charted a political path forward for Northern Ireland and that laid out the principles of what it would mean to live peaceably, respecting the rights of all, and this principle of consent. And so what happened was this agreement had to then go to the people of Northern Ireland, and it had to be voted on by a referendum. And so people received this booklet about the agreement that included all of this information. And then in 1998, they went out, and people from all out turned out and voted. I think it required 2/3 for it to pass. And I think 71% of the people of Northern Ireland voted for this peace accord. And to this day, that peace accord has largely held. The people there would tell you they're a long way from living in true peace with each other, but the violent conflict has ended. And the nation, and especially the city of Belfast, are a very different place now than it used to be. It is a beautiful city and a place of peace where now, for the first time the last few years, cruise ships come in and out of Belfast. And and it's a beautiful place to visit. So I want to move on next. Basically, this mural, I don't know if you can read it, but it basically is a sign of that kind of agreement of the people saying, no more violence, no more killing. It is time to live together in a different way. So that takes you through the history. And I want to tell you a little bit about now of our trip and about how we encountered this history. This is the group of us. There were 18 of us from Western North Carolina, along with our leader, Gary Mason. And I wanted to let you know, we didn't only tour places only related to the violence. There were other parts of the trip. This is our leader, Gary Mason, who is a Methodist minister from Belfast, who served for a long time in East Belfast, a Protestant area where there were a lot of the Protestant paramilitaries that he tried to minister to and work with. And he now leads a group called Rethinking Conflict, which brings groups of people there to learn from the experience of Northern Ireland. Very often, Gary and his group will bring Israeli and Palestinian teenagers and youth to Belfast. And they will talk about what it looks like when people who've been trying to kill each other can actually learn to live in nonviolent peace with each other and what it took to get there. So we stayed, when we were there, at a place called the Europa Hotel, which itself is part of the history. The Europa is where many times visiting diplomats would come and stay during the Troubles. And because of that, during those 30 years, it was estimated it was bombed over 30 times, or at least attempted to be bombed. There were bombs that were defused in the lobby of the hotel where we stayed. But today it is this beautiful downtown and this wonderful area where we could stay. And again, we did do some fun things. There was a free afternoon. I got to walk along the coastline outside of Belfast, which is just absolutely beautiful. We worshiped one Sunday at St. Anne's Cathedral, which is an Anglican cathedral in the city. That spire you can see is called the Spire of Hope, and it's this kind of clear crystal steeple that is meant to be a sign of hope that the church offers, pointing heavenward amid the conflict of the world. It was just a beautiful place to worship for us. We visited a Methodist ministry called Skanos. That word comes from the Greek word for tent, and it's based on the scripture that says that God in Jesus, the Word became flesh and pitched its tent among us. The idea is that God comes to where we are and plants God's self there. And that's what the Methodist Church had done with Skanos, is it set up this ministry in East Belfast to the homeless. There's food offered there. There is a thrift store, and it ministers to that community. One morning I got up early and I hiked to a hilltop overlooking the city of Belfast. And it was just a gorgeous view, and I wanted to show it to you. This is looking out at the harbor. Many of you know the Titanic was built in Belfast. It sailed out of Belfast. And a local told me that the day it sailed, there were thousands of people who climbed up to this hill and who watched the Titanic sail out of the harbor over the horizon at the end there. So I want to give you just if it's been too much heavy history, I want to see if this will work, Josh, this video. I want to give you show you a moment of Zen. Okay, so this is your moment of Zen. This is from the top of that hilltop. Okay, that's your 30 seconds of Zen and peace today. There's a story in the Bible where Jesus sits on a hilltop and looks down over Jerusalem. And I think it's in Luke. He says that he weeps over the city and says, "Would that you knew the things that made for peace." Like he weeps over the city, wishing it knew what peace required. And I can imagine Jesus doing that over Belfast in the worst days of the Troubles. So we also, some of you took part in a C.S. Lewis study we did last year. C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast. He lived there the first 10 or 12 years of his life. And so we visited a few sites associated with that. This is a mural that was painted in East Belfast. And it was painted to replace one of the violent murals like I showed you a little earlier. There was a program that Gary Mason and others engaged in where they tried to repaint all of the murals of violence with peaceful images. And he told us, there was a BBC reporter who said, "Gary, do you really think that's going to do any good?" And Gary said, "Well, let me tell you something. There is a 6-year-old girl who lives right across from that home. And for the first 6 years of her life, all she has known, she has woke up in the morning to a man in a ski mask and holding an AK-47. And now she wakes up in the morning and she sees Aslan the lion. Which do you think is better?" So that's one of the ways that Gary and others have been working for peace. We visited C.S. Lewis Park. That's a statue of Aslan the lion up there. That house is the house C.S. Lewis was born in. It's called Little Lee. Someone lives there, so we couldn't go to that. But we saw some really neat places in the midst of all that. And so I want to shift now, and I want to talk to you for a minute about some of the people we talked to and what they told us about the conflict. You remember how I told you the Protestants celebrate the victory of King William of Orange in 1690, over the Catholic forces. When you go around Belfast, you will see all these murals celebrating that history. And so there's even a picture of King William from 300 years ago, We're going to talk in a minute about the role of history and conflict, because that's a big part of things. But you go around the city and you see all these different murals. This is a mural that we saw entering a Protestant area of Belfast. And many of this conflict, it was a lot like a gang conflict, like we think of the Bloods and the Crips today. Like, this is our part of town, this is our neighborhood. There was that element to some of it. This is in another Protestant area, another one of these murals. So this is what people would wake up to, and this is who the people were looked up to as heroes to some, these people who are fighting. But at the same time, you'll drive through the city and you'll see these memorials that are dedicated to victims of the Troubles. And this was set up by Protestants, basically saying, never forget, these are all the awful things that the IRA did. And then you go to the Catholic part of town, and you can imagine what you see there, right? You see very different things. You see a memorial to the IRA people who died in the struggle. So we talked with a man I told you about on Sunday named Jerry McConville. And Jerry McConville was 10 years old when the Troubles started. And what he remembered was, at that age, some loyalist gangs burned down some houses on his street amid the rioting. And his family, who were strong nationalists, Irish, helped the bombed out people, the people that had no place to stay. So he was 10 years old. And then he remembered the British soldiers coming in, and he remembered his 14-year-old friend Desi being shot and killed in the conflict that happened and that ensued out of that. And so what that did to him is it led him to decide at the ripe old age of 12 to become involved in helping the IRA. Again, it's not that different from a teenager who grows up in a gang territory and who decides, well, this is who my people are, this is what I've got to do, these are the people I have to support. And he became involved at age 15 carrying weapons for the IRA and in the conflict against soldiers. And he was finally arrested and sent to jail while still a teenager. While he was in jail, he experienced a kind of change. He and the other people in jail, and he was in there, I think, during the time of some of the hunger strikers, began to talk about the solution to the problems they were having. And many of them, some of them came to feel that violence alone was never going to get them the independence they were seeking. And he said one of the things he realized were that his opponents, the Protestants, were also part of his country too. And that he was never going to be able to just eliminate them, but that he was going to have to come to some way to figure out how to live in peace with them. And so when he got out, Gary became involved in inner city ministry and education, and he began to work, sometimes with Protestants, in ensuring more peaceful means. And he became an advocate, he said, almost against his will, for the peace agreement. One of the most powerful things that Jerry told us was that what saved him, what he believes saves people from conflict, is relationship. That when you actually come to know the people you are in conflict with, it makes it hard for you to dehumanize them. You can no longer view them as just a representative of an issue. And it makes it harder to hate them. And so what he talked about was the importance in engaging in conversation in spaces with people who view things very differently than you do. He went on, so we next, after we visited Gary, we went and saw a man named Harry Stockman. So Harry was on the other side. Harry was a member of a Protestant paramilitary group. And he also, at a young age, he was about the same age, 11 or 12, began working with the UVF and helping them and helping run guns for them. And he, at a very similar age, was arrested and sent to jail. And he, over time, came to see the futility of violence. He feels just as strongly today as he ever did about wanting to remain part of the United Kingdom. But he believes just as strongly that violence never accomplishes the ends that you want to find and that you want to discover in those ways. One of the things he talked about was that people who glamorize violence, who call for shootings and bombings, have no idea what it's actually like. And they have never suffered the depth of that pain. And he wasn't only referring to the victims, but I think he was also referring to what violence does to the person who commits it. And that's one of the lessons I think I took away from going to Northern Ireland, including the book that we read. Violence doesn't just hurt the victim, but it deforms and destroys the insides of the people who commit it, whether they recognize it at the time or not. Harry went on to say, it is so much easier to start violence than to turn it off. The last thing I want for my children and grandchildren is they ever experience what I did. But now, one of the things he told us is at one time, Harry was actively engaged in trying to kill Catholics. Today, his son just married a Catholic girl. And he said he is so happy for them and so excited for them. And one of the things that I learned is marriages like that are a sign of hope in the world and a sign of peace. So there were other folks that we talked to. This was a man who was the High Sheriff of Belfast. That means he's the representative of the king. King Charles's picture was on the wall. He also is wearing a golden kind of medallion bling thing, like it is blingy, that I think is actual gold. And if I heard right, I think it's worth $50,000. Like it's a sign of his office. But he's a very down-to-earth guy, and so he let several members of our group put it on and take a picture with it, which I'd been scared to death. I never would have touched it. I did not go near that thing. But he told us his story. Everyone there has a history of growing up as a teenager, and he wasn't involved in any conflict, but then an IRA bomb went off at a shop, and he ran towards it to help get people out of that. And his sister came up to him, and his sister had just left the shop, and he realized that if it had been 1 minute different, his sister would have been killed. And that radicalized him. And so he joined a Protestant gang, a paramilitary gang, to combat the IRA, and he was shot at and was tried to kill, and he spent some time in prison. But again, then he became a different person. One of the lessons that I think I also learned there is that many of the people, even those involved in the violence, were not what you would call like terrible people. But what happened is they were in a terrible situation that they got caught up in. And we know that because Gary told us the prison recidivism rate, that of all of the 30,000 people that went to prison during the Troubles, only 2% have ever returned to prison. And so he views that as a sign that like there was this madness that engulfed everybody. And it wasn't just so-called evil people that got caught up in it. People who could have been living decent lives, like Sammy, like Jerry, like Harry, were caught up in it too. One of the things that Sammy quoted for us at the end of his talk was that he quoted a proverb. And he quoted and he said, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. And he says that's what many people experienced in Northern Ireland. I'm going to go a little faster now because I want to get through things and I don't want to bore you. But we heard from a man named John Brewer, who is a professor in Northern Ireland. And his topic with us was religious violence and why it is religion sometimes turns violent or becomes a cover for violence. And he just took us through how this can happen and how what most often happens is conflicts like this aren't basically religious at all. The conflict between Protestant and Catholics in Northern Ireland was not about theology or Holy Communion or the Pope or beliefs about Jesus. It was a political dispute about which country they belonged to. But what happened is that religious faith got sucked up into that. The political became more important than the religious. And so the religious became a justification for the political fighting and violence. And it became a justification for looking at the other group as somehow morally inferior or against God. Dr. Brewer quoted a Bob Dylan line in his talk to us. He said, "You don't count the dead when God is on your side." You don't count the dead when God is on your side. And part of what he wanted to warn us about was the dangerous fusion that happens when politics uses religion for its own purposes. And so that was a very sobering commentary that we shared with him, with Dr. Brewer. And we'll come back to that in a minute. We also met with a woman named Judith, who was the commissioner for victims and survivors. Her role after the Troubles ended and the peace accords were signed was to advocate for the victims and their families who wanted to know what had happened to their loved one, why it had happened, who wanted their stories to be told, and who were seeking healing. And so she talked to us about some of the things that are necessary for people to heal after they've suffered great trauma. And we even heard not only from Judith, but a little bit later from two victims, Alan McBride and the woman who's here, whose name just escapes me right away. But I'll come back to that. It was Linda, what was it again, Bev? Linda Malloy. I didn't introduce Bev earlier, but our district superintendent, Bev, is with us tonight. She joined us on the journey, and we do a lot better job presenting this, but she's gracious to come and hear this. Alan and Linda shared their stories with us. Alan and his wife Sharon had a 3-year-old. Sharon's father owned the fish shop on Shank Hill Road. And the morning of the bombing, Alan went out for a bike ride. He and Sharon had got into a kind of argument. He took their daughter. Sharon went to the shop to help her dad. And both his wife and his father-in-law were killed in the bombing. And he made his way to the scene just afterwards. And what he talked about was the process of healing that he has undergone for that, where he went through this process of anger. I think at one point he turned to drink to try to just get through and to numb the pain. He turned to protesting against the leaders of the IRA and those who were sympathizers with them. But he talked about how sharing his story was a way that God began to bring healing into his life. And he talked specifically about going to a conference once where where he and some other victims of the Troubles were going to share their story. And among the other victims were Roman Catholic victims of Protestant violence. And he found that when the victims got together and shared their stories, that the equation became different. And he came to realize that there's sufferings on all sides, that everybody's hurting. And he describes one night where he and a friend were going to a bar after the session, and one of the Catholic guys was there, and he felt he had no choice but to invite this person out to drinks with them. And so he did. And he described how over drinks they each shared their story with each other, and how this man, after Gary had shared his story, this man who had even been involved in some violence himself, just told him, "Alan, I am so sorry. What happened to you was so wrong." And he just talked about how hearing someone say those words was healing for him in different ways. Linda shared her own story, which was a deeply tragic story of her son, John, who was, by all accounts, just an amazing young man. Growing up on the Roman Catholic side of town, when her son had got involved in throwing rocks at the other side, she and her husband decided to move them to a place that they felt would be more safe in a more mixed neighborhood. When John grew up and was 18, he went out for drinks one night with a group of friends, decided to come back early on his own, and was murdered by a Protestant gang on the way home. And one of the things that you just took away from Linda's talk is the deep, unending grief and pain that she has endured because of suffering that. She wrote us a really beautiful poem called "Some Mother's Son," where she addresses the killers of her son. I wrote down one line: "We share a commonality through a fatality." Do you think about that in your room? One of the things Linda told us is that in spite of all that happened, she has come to know a lot of Protestant people through the process of sharing her story, and has learned that we're all the same. And now she sincerely desires to not just be a victim, but to be a peacemaker, that she wants to help others. And the work that she's done, and I don't know how a person can do this work, I guess I do. She has worked with a children's hospice for over 20 years, taking care of children whom she knows are going to die. And one of the things she said was, "I never got to say goodbye to John, so at least I can help these others say goodbye to their children." Yeah. It's just a remarkable witness of the ability of some people to, by the grace of God, to find healing and to move beyond the pain and trauma and tragedy of their life and move it towards something good. So I'm going to stop now on the part of this that's about our trip. And if you would like to learn more about the conflict in Northern Ireland, if this history interests you at all, there's a documentary series called Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland that was done last year by the BBC. And it's really powerful because it's told completely through documentary film footage and through the stories of people like Alan and Linda who lived through these experiences. I think it's available on Amazon Prime Video, but it's one of those things you have to sign up for a free subscription that they hope you'll forget, and I always forget. So, just keep that in mind, if you decide you want to watch this, but it's very powerful. There's also a best-selling book that came out a couple years ago that's called Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland. And much of that is about some of the things that the IRA did in Northern Ireland, as told through the stories of some people who got sucked into the organization. It's one of those that's hard to put down. It's kind of like a crime thriller. It's the wrong word because it's not thrilling. It's tragedy, but you feel like you understand some of what was happening. So I want to turn now to some final thoughts on peace building. And I'll try not to go on too long, y'all, because this can go on for a long time. And I want to share with you, like, why I think this is important, like why it matters that we're learning about Northern Ireland, of all places, today. So there is a movie that was just released a couple weeks ago. It's called Civil War. I haven't seen it. I probably won't see it. But the whole premise of the movie is that the United States has descended into political conflict. And not just conflict, but violent conflict in our day and age. And it's kind of an imaginary situation. But one of the things that Gary Mason kept repeating to us is that he kept saying, I'm worried about your country. I have lived through deep political conflict and even violent conflict. And there are so many of the elements that are happening in your country that happened in our country. Like if you think back through the story of some of the things that have happened, there are so many of those things that we have had our own experiences of in the last number of years. Okay? And Gary believes it is really important for people to understand how conflicts like this can become violent and what people can do to avoid such conflicts. Okay? So I think there are a few lessons of warning from the situation in Ireland. Part of the story is the harm that happens when the rights and fears and the suffering of minority groups are ignored or not listened to. So that's one thing. There's the danger of paramilitary organizations and unregulated weapons, which is part of what happened. These extremist paramilitary groups began to fight each other, and then everybody else was caught in the middle. I don't believe the United States is going to engage in any kind of civil war like the blue and the gray and the north and the south where people are, but it's not that far-fetched for me to believe that after a deep political dispute, there might be extremists on one side of things who decide that we're going to set a bomb or do something violent. And that leads to people on the other extreme to decide, well, we've got to fight back and we've got to do that. And what happens then is the cycle begins, the cycle of violence, and where everybody else is caught in the middle, and where other people are caught and trapped in it. The peril of religious nationalism. I don't know if you remember that mural I showed you, For God and Ulster. You remember that? That was the motto of the Ulster Volunteer Force. And do you know what the motto of the IRA was? For God and Ireland. And what happens was God was co-opted for their political cause. Right? And what Gary said, don't do God and anything. Just do God, for God, for God. And don't get confused in thinking this other thing matters in the same way that God does. Do not ever use God's name just to justify your own beliefs or your own political beliefs. That's called blasphemy. But he did say that anytime groups of people think that, again, God is on our side and God is against their side 100%, that is the recipe for deep conflict. It's never the recipe for peace. There's the trap of violence. One of the things we heard over and over is people think violence works, that sometimes you have to fight, you have to do those things. And always violence destroys what it's trying to accomplish. It just prolongs the conflict. You can't do away with your adversary completely. You can't eliminate them. You can delay the consequences, but you're always sowing a harvest of future hatred and other things. Oh, there's something to be said about the weaponization of the past. Gary said the past is meant to be learned from and not lived in. Some of the people we met in Northern Ireland were still living in the past, in those conflicts. And the past had such a hold of them that they could no longer move forward to the future. Gary said there's a reason that rearview mirrors are much smaller than front windshields. And he says for peace in any group of people to happen, people have to decide they care more about the well-being of their grandchildren than they do the grudges of their ancestors. So the last thing, the outcome of segregation in terms of warning signs. I shared this quote with some of you on Sunday and in our council meeting, but in the documentary, one woman says, the real roots of the conflict were that we were segregated and we didn't know each other. We lived apart. And segregation produced ignorance. And ignorance produced hatred. And hatred produced the violence. And violence produced the death. And the death produced more death, which led to more segregation, which led to more ignorance and hatred and violence and death. And that's the cycle. And the way that you break the cycle is through relationship. Through genuinely coming to know and hear those who are different from you and who you live apart from. That is how peace is made. We're just about out of time, but I want to share a few last thoughts with you that come not just from our conflict, but from things that I think I've learned. There's a book called The Anatomy of Peace. And what it says is that peace is something that always has to begin deep inside of us, deep inside our hearts. And that it has to do with our choice of whether we live with a heart at war towards someone or somebody or a group of other people, or whether we live with a heart of peace towards them. When we live with a heart at war, what happens is we see ourselves as somehow better than or more important than or far more right than another. And we look down on them. And the minute that we look at others with the heart of war, we develop eyes of war, where we no longer can see them as human beings. We see them as something less than human beings, as an object or as a representative of this cause or this group that I dislike or that I disagree with. What we never see them is as the human being that they are in all their complexity. And so our heart at war causes us to have eyes at war, and we're no longer able to see them. One of the things that means is that once we dehumanize somebody, we start calling them names. We give them nicknames that allow us to then see them as something less than human. In Ireland, the Protestants were sometimes called Huns by the Catholics. The Catholics were called Fenians by the Protestants. And once you can call someone by a derogatory name like that, you've just given yourself permission to hate them a little bit. You have eyes of war. And when you have eyes of war, you have ears of war. And that means you can't hear them. You cannot hear what they're saying. They can be telling you something the whole time, and you will not be able to hear it. It will not ever register with you. You won't be willing to listen, even when they might be right. And if you have ears of war, then you have a tongue of war. You start using those names. You start using those words. You start saying things that are bitter or hateful or mean. And all this started from a heart at war towards another person. But a different thing can happen if you start with a heart of peace towards another person. Where what you say to is that my deepest desire is your well-being. That doesn't mean we think they're right. It doesn't mean we don't think they did something very wrong. It doesn't mean we're not even angry with them or hurt by them. But I am battling within my heart to have a heart at peace towards you, where I do not mean you harm or ill. And if I can hold my heart in that place of peace, even if I disagree with you, Then I have eyes of peace, and I see you. I see you as a human being, the person that you are. I see the image of God in you, because every human being bears God's image. And when I see you and every human being as bearing the image of God, then I have ears of peace. I'm willing to listen to what you have to say. I may not disagree with you. I may think you're profoundly wrong or misguided or hurting things the way you're doing, but I will at least hear you. And then because I have ears of peace, I have a tongue of peace. I say words that build people up rather than tearing them down. I say really hard to say phrases like, I'm sorry, I was wrong, or tell me more. And all that comes from having a heart of peace. Now, what that means is that peace is, first of all, a constant battle within ourselves of how we are towards other people. And that is our calling as peacemakers in the world. One of the things Gary said is that he really believes that the Church of Jesus is meant to be the example of this in the world. That politics and conflict and society are always overwhelmed by what he calls the noise of now. But we are a people who listen for the calling of eternity. Everybody else, politicians, everything else, they all think short term. We are thinking the longest possible term of forever. We are the people who know a thing or two about healing, about repentance, about confession and transformation. And so what Gary says is if the church is not going to be the voice of peace and the example of peace, then who is? Then who is? We did encounter examples of this in Northern Ireland. We did not meet, Father Alec Reed died some years ago, but he was a Roman Catholic priest I read about who spent his entire life not in the headlines, but quietly going back and forth among Protestants and Catholics and earning their trust and helping them try to understand each other. There was an incident in 1988. It was a horrible incident where a group of off-duty Protestant British soldiers were dragged from a car by a mob and were brutally killed by some people related to the IRA. This happened on television. Father Alec Reed, a Roman Catholic priest, ran to try to rescue these Protestant soldiers and pleaded for help for them and sought to try to save their life and administer to them last rites. And later, Father Alec Reed, many people would say, was the person who did more behind the scenes than anyone else to lay the kind of dialogue that was required for the peace process to happen. That is what the church and the people of Jesus can be. And I believe that's what we're called to be in our lives as individuals and in the world. So I'm gonna stop. I have more I can say. I've already kept you over time. But I wanted to close with a prayer, if I could. And then I'm gonna end this part, and then I'm gonna ask if Bev Copley would come up and give us kind of a closing benediction thought. There is a prayer called the Prayer of Eusebius that was written by an early church historian way back in the 400s. So this is a really old prayer. And I think this prayer expresses to me what it might mean to be a person who has a true heart of peace. All right. So I just want you to listen to these words. And if something in this resonates with you as you're leaving tonight, I have a few copies of it. If you want to take it away and look at it or pray it or study it, you can. But this is the prayer of Eusebius. May I be no person's enemy, and may I be the friend of that which is eternal and abides. May I never quarrel with those nearest me, and if I do, may I be reconciled quickly. May I love, seek, and attain only that which is good. May I wish for the happiness of all and envy none. May I never rejoice in the ill fortune of one who has wronged me. When I have done or said what is wrong myself, may I never wait for the rebuke of others, but always rebuke myself until I make amends. May I win no victory that harms either me or my opponent. May I reconcile friends who are angry with one another. May I never fail a friend who is in danger. When visiting those in grief, may I be able by gentle and healing words to soften their pain. May I respect myself. May I always keep tame that which rages within me. May I accustom myself to be gentle and never be angry with people because of circumstances. And may I never discuss who is wicked and what wicked things they have done, but may I know good men and women and follow in their footsteps. Amen. That is a heart of peace. So I'd like to invite Bev Copley to come up and help us close this time. It was wonderful traveling with Bev, and Bev, you could probably do this for an hour. I know just what you experienced too. So it should work. Yeah. Oh, it's not on. Let me turn it on for you.
From our district were a part of this trip, and it was a joy to be a fellow traveler with Jeremy and with Reverend Otto Harris at West Market Street and Reverend Tammy Ingram from Bass Chapel and Raleigh's Crossroad, a partner in your missional network. And I think if I could just express appreciation to Jeremy, not only for companionship on the trip, but for how he has articulated what we all learned together. And I think if I could say anything about the trip is that each voice said, "Don't go there. Don't go there, America." And it was very deep. It's a very heavy trip. I'm still, like Jeremy and everyone else, still reflecting on it. But I think that 4 of us were taking part from the Greensboro area because of how important our city is to peace and how important our history is in this city, having witnessed struggles, having witnessed violence. And so we can play a tremendous part. One of the things that was said over and over, despite the fact that this was a very church-related struggle, Catholics versus Protestant, is that the church wasn't involved enough as peacemakers. It was about the church, but in so many ways, the clergy and Christians didn't stand up for peace and for each other and for each other's children and grandchildren. So it was a time of great learning. It was a very sobering experience. This is a very small partitioned part of a very small country in Western Europe, which has in it the most bombed hotel in the world, militarized. For a very long time, it was the most highly militarized zone in all of Western Europe. And 26 years afterwards, still anticipates another 25 years before they truly can heal from what they've been through. So I heard that, and I've been reflecting on it a lot, and I see each of you as influencers for peace. And Jesus taught us, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." And each of us claim this identity, and we want to be known as those people. So just so you can say that when you left, you were twice blessed tonight, I want to read a prayer that's been circulating in my spirit since I returned. And it's a prayer for peaceable conversations, and it comes from the Native American tradition. And so with this, we will be dismissed tonight. And thank you for letting me be a part of learning and being among you here at Guilford College tonight. Lord, make our hearts places of peace and our minds harbors of tranquility. Sow in our souls true love for you and for one another, and root deeply within us friendship and unity and concord with reverence. So may we give peace to each other sincerely and receive it beautifully. Amen. Good night.
Tonight. Thanks for being here.